Hello everybody and welcome to this introductory webinar looking at what is PDA. My name's Sarah. I've been working for the PDA Society for nearly 3 years now, and my personal connection with PDA is through my youngest son, who has a diagnosis of autism with a PDA profile. I'm joined this evening by two of my colleagues, Karen Stepanova and Tom. Would you two just like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Karen. I've been training with the PDA Society for just over a year now. Started off doing parent carer courses, but now do more work within the education. I have a background in teaching in further and adult education, and both my children are diagnosed autistic, but my son, who is 16, has a PDA profile. That's me.
Hi, I'm Tom Krellin. My daughter is now 17. She was diagnosed with autism roughly 10 years ago, and I started volunteering for the PDA Society shortly after that.
Lovely, that's great. So the format for this webinar really is a question and answer between the three of us as trainers for the PDA Society, but we thought it'd be helpful to start off just with some introductory slides to share so that we can all start on the same page. So PDA stands for Pathological Demand Avoidance. And PDA people are driven to avoid demands due to their high anxiety levels when they feel that they're not in control. So we might all feel that there are times when we want to avoid demands. There were several things I could have done before recording this evening, but I managed to avoid doing that. But PDA children and adults do so to a pathological degree. So in other words, their avoidance is clinically significant in its extent and its extreme nature. And the really important point to understand is that they don't avoid because they want to, but because they can't not. So our understanding of the autism spectrum is still evolving. We do know that autism is dimensional and that it involves a complex and overlapping pattern of strengths, differences and challenges that present differently in one individual to another and can present differently in the same person at different times or in different environments. So there is no one size fits all. And likewise, there is no one size fits all when it comes to understanding which approaches or support may be most helpful. These really do need to be tailored towards the individual. But in reality, a more blanket approach to diagnosing and supporting autism is often taken, which can and does lead to poor outcomes. So within the umbrella term of autism, it can be helpful to recognise clusters or traits or similar ways in which autism can sometimes present as a signpost to effective identification and support. Another way to explain this is by using the term profile. And since Professor Elizabeth Newson, who was a developmental psychologist, first recognised PDA back in the 1980s, we have come a long way. But in reality, we're still at an early stage of our understanding of PDA, and much more research is needed. But the majority of work done so far suggests that PDA is best understood as a profile on the autism spectrum. So individuals with a PDA profile meet the criteria for autism, meaning that they will have some differences in social interaction, communication and sensory processing, and also some restrictive or repetitive behaviours. It is important to note, however, that these traits may not always be that obvious with a PDA profile, at least until you get to know the individual. And in addition to meeting the criteria for autism, they'll have many of the key features of a PDA profile, which we'll have a look at on this next slide. So firstly, a PDA profile of autism means that the individuals share autistic characteristics, currently defined as persistent challenges with social communication and social interaction, and restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviour, activities or specialised interests, and often including a sensory experience in relation to sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing, and internal senses such as hunger or thirst. And also have many of the key features of a PDA profile. So the first one, resisting and avoiding the ordinary demands of life. The key word here is ordinary. This is not about a defiant challenge to authority, but more about seemingly mundane, everyday things that we would perhaps take for granted. They can use social strategies as part of the avoidance, so not just refusing or withdrawing, but using a range of techniques to get out of doing something. So they could start giving excuses, distracting, playing deaf, procrastinating, or drowning out the demand with noise. They can appear sociable, but lacking some understanding, and appearing sociable is one of the reasons why autism can be initially missed in PDA, although this usually masks underlying challenges, including low self-esteem. And PDA children may have a better use of eye contact and conversational timing than you would expect to see, but often this sociability lacks depth of understanding. The individual may also lack a sense of social responsibility, so the rules apply to others, but not to them. And they may not confer any automatic respect based on someone's age or position in social hierarchy. So if you think about the school setting, for the example, there may be an expectation that when the head teacher walks into the classroom, there's an expectation that you stand up. For a PDA, they just wouldn't do that. And it's not that they're being deliberately disrespectful, it's just hierarchy doesn't exist in their world. They can experience intense emotions and rapid mood swings, sometimes referred to as Jekyll and Hyde characteristics. They can be impulsive and unpredictable, and emotional regulation appears to be very poor, with the individual either at one end of the emotional spectrum or the other, but rarely in that middle ground. And distressed behaviours, so things like meltdowns, shutdowns, aggression and self-injury. They can often feel that they've come out of the blue with little time to be aware of the trigger or to deal with the rising anxiety that underpins them. They can also go quickly and leave us struggling to catch up with what's just taken place. And whilst not always a feature, this is quite common, that they can appear comfortable in role play and pretense, and this can be to an extreme extent, with youngsters living out the life in the role of a cat or a fox, and adults too adopting different personas. The role play can often be a conscious strategy used to avoid demands, but it can also be an unconscious coping strategy. So if you think about it, they go to a world that's safe, it's predictable, and within their control. So it's often a less threatening and much safer place to be than the reality of the real world. And then they can focus intently, often on other people. So with PDA, the restrictive or repetitive interests are often social in nature, relating to real or fictional people. And then there's this need for control, which is often driven by anxiety or an automatic threat response in the face of demands. And as previously some of you may be aware, it's important to remember that often PDA children have real difficulty with intolerance of uncertainty, and that was identified in research from Newcastle University. And the rise in anxiety that uncertainty causes may be the key to understanding why PDA children display certain behaviours, and therefore it could be a helpful starting point in refining and further developing support that will help these children. And then finally, there's a tendency not to respond to conventional approaches, and that could be conventional parenting approaches or teaching approaches or general support approaches. And I can honestly say that, you know, having been asked to attend a Triple P parenting course when we first had challenges before we understood about PDA, I can honestly say it was quite stressful, because the strategies that I was being asked to try out at home, all the strategies that had worked brilliantly for my eldest neurotypical son, just made my PDA's behaviours and struggles and his anxiety levels really, really escalate. So we found this slide quite helpful, and it shows a very generalised comparison that gives a quick visual overview of how a PDA profile of autism may present differently from other autism profiles, with more obvious differences in social interaction and communication on the left, lots of overlap in the middle, and on the right, whilst others may experience rapid mood swings and demand avoidance as well, the extent of these is likely to be greater in a PDA profile. So let's have a think about demands and demand avoidance, and think about how it can actually be perceived by a PDA person. Demands from a PDA perspective are many and they're cumulative, and it can be helpful to think about different types of demands. So different types might include indirect demands, so such as praise, which can lead to anxiety over future expectations, maybe to do the same thing again, rather than the intended positive reinforcement. And we often hear about children who've maybe come home from school and they've done a great piece of work, and the parent or carer says, "Oh, wow, that's lovely, fantastic, well done," and the piece of work or the picture gets screwed up. Time can be an indirect demand on top of the demand itself. So transitions as well, so moving from a pleasant activity perhaps to something else can cause real rises in anxiety. And also, if you think about it, time is pressured. You know, if we're hurrying to do something on top of the demand itself, again, that can cause a rise in anxiety and be perceived as even more demanding. And then uncertainty, as we've mentioned before, not knowing or not being in control of what's happening can also trigger anxiety. And then we have demands within demands. So the smaller implied demands within the larger ones. So if you think about going to the cinema, that's actually a demand in itself. But when you get there, there's the expectation that you have to remain seated. You have to respond appropriately. You might be sitting next to people that you don't actually know. You have to be quiet. You can't use your phone. So all those much smaller demands within the larger one. And then there's the I ought to feelings of daily life. So, oh, I really ought to get up. It's close to 8 o'clock. Or I really ought to take a shower. I've not had one for a few days. Or, you know, cleaning my teeth. And then there's our own internal demands, such as thirst or needing to go to the bathroom, as well as thoughts and wishes. And it is worth noting that sensory differences in general can play a huge part in increasing an individual's ability to cope. But these can also be magnified with interoception and understanding internal bodily demands. So interoception is your ability to understand what your body is telling you. So the sensation of needing to go to the bathroom, being hot, being cold, being thirsty, being tired, they can often be quite confusing for a PDA individual. And then demands can be things that we want to do as well. So it's not just the things that we want to avoid, like housework or homework. So it can, you know, even things like hobbies, seeing friends or special occasions, not just the things that we don't want to do. And certainly as a parent, that's one thing I found was particularly confusing was, you know, I knew my son desperately wanted to do something, but when the time came, he was unable to do that, or would sabotage it, maybe by misbehaving, so that I would impose a sanction and remove whatever it was that he was wanting to do. And when he was much younger, he expressed an interest in judo. And I thought, fantastic, something that he really wants to do. So he went to a couple of taster sessions, and then, you know, after he'd been to those, I made the mistake of actually buying the kit, and he never went again from that point on, because all of a sudden it was too much pressure. There was the expectation that now he has to go because mum's bought me the actual kit. So we do tend to find quite a few PDA families with cupboards full of musical instruments, specialist kits, sports equipment, all those sorts of things. Okay. And then there are the more obvious direct requests or requests from others. So put your shoes on, you need to do your work, would you like a drink? We'll have a look at those again a little bit later on, no doubt, in the discussion. So finally, we thought it'd be helpful to think about what demand avoidance may look like in reality. So there is usually a hierarchy of avoidance approaches with PDA, although escalation can be very rapid, especially if pushed. And sometimes the middle sections that you see there are skipped, and a person can go straight from calm and able very quickly to distress behaviours at the top of the triangle. So if we start off at the bottom, you can see they're calm and able. And it is worth noting that I was recently having a discussion with a PDA adult, and she said that actually there is never a time when she feels calm and able. She's always got some level of low level anxiety. So, you know, never actually feeling in that green zone. So initial avoidance approaches might include things like distraction. So, oh, look at that dog, it's so cute. Come and have a look at this. Making excuses. Oh, I can't do that right now, my tummy's hurting. Or procrastinating, so I'll do it in a minute. If you just leave me alone, I'll do it in 5 minutes. And then inevitably that rolls over to the next day. If tolerance is low and anxiety increases, you might then move into the purple zone. So physical incapacitation. So, oh, my legs have stopped working. Or withdrawing into fantasy. So, well, I can't get dressed because cats don't wear clothes. Or they might reduce meaningful conversation. So they might start mimicking the person making the demand or bombarding them with noise. And then once we get into the orange zone, what you might see is somebody taking complete control because their anxiety is so heightened, it's so severe that they just want to take control of the situation. Or on the flip side of that, you might see complete compliance, where the individual is just flying under the radar, avoiding attracting any more attention to themselves and just doing as they're asked. Because if I do what I'm asked and I don't make a fuss, then nobody's likely to, or people are less likely to ask me to do something. So there is a bit of a flip there. And then finally, if we don't notice some of these more subtle signs of anxiety levels being on the increase, we might then see the extreme upset, the agitation, some self-injurious behaviours, the shutdown, the aggression, or even just running away. So the real fight, flight or freeze mechanism just kicks in. And it is so important to understand that once an individual gets to this stage, they lose cognitive function. This is a real panic. It's not just challenging behaviour or a temper tantrum. It really is a panic attack that needs support and understanding. So that is just a whistle-stop tour of what demand avoidance can look like. And just to reiterate the point that sometimes we may think a meltdown or distress behaviour has come completely out of the blue, but actually it might just be that we've missed some of the more subtle signs of that anxiety escalating. Okay, so Karen and Tom, some questions that we thought might be helpful for our audience if we can discuss them. One of the first ones is we often hear that for PDA people, avoidance is not a choice, it's a case of can't, not won't. Karen, I don't know if you want to perhaps have a go at explaining why that might be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I have an example in my head of a favourite trip that my son used to love going to. There's a specific place that was his favourite place. And the anxiety of guilt, the expectation around him having sort of enjoying it, the fact that the whole build-up of getting there would be a challenge in itself because he would be so excited. But he would then have thoughts about, well, what if I get there? What if I don't enjoy it? What am I doing? So all of these things going on in his head, his anxiety is rising because his own expectations on himself that he's going to enjoy. And then one time when we arrived there, it was busier than he'd expected. It was busier than it had been the previous time. And he immediately went from sort of the orange, he definitely wasn't calm and able. He had all this anticipation and he just couldn't do the thing that was his favorite thing to do because it was just too much. So we had to remove him. He had quite a long panic attack that went on for, kept him safe, and that's what we did, and he was safe. But the disappointment then afterwards, and that was I think that's an example of, we so often will talk about school and all these experiences, but it's the things that they love to do that they also can't do. And it's Absolutely. Not because they won't, it's because they literally can't because of everything that's going on inside.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Tom, have you got anything additional?
Yeah, I mean, exactly the same, that these experiences where she's really keen to get out there, she's built it up over time, but when it comes to the day, it's just too much. And if we think about the slide we've just seen on the on what those 5 levels are, you'll see it is an anxiety issue, and it builds up into a fight or flight adrenaline fueled response. And there's nothing we can do once we get into that mode, is there? That any of us, when we're in that level of fear and anxiety, it is not something that's in our control.
Absolutely. And I've heard it described as well by Isaac, who has a channel on YouTube. When he talks about it, he said it's like cognitively he knows that he wants to do it, but then another part of his brain just kicks in and says, well, no, you can't do that. So he desperately wants to, but there's just something that stops him being able to do that. Absolutely. Okay. So we often get asked about, is it important to actually identify a PDA profile of autism? So Tom, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on whether or not you feel it's important.
It certainly does depend on the situation, what you're facing, and who you need to communicate with. I always feel that a diagnosis really is about getting a good understanding of what's going on and helping people who are supporting a person with PDA to have a common understanding and a good description of what's happening. In our case, we didn't go all the way to a diagnosis of PDA. We stopped at a diagnosis of autism, partly because we don't have that many other people involved in Ciara's support. And so we didn't need that additional understanding. But understanding for me really is key, and a diagnosis that leads to understanding is really helpful as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I know, you know, in my personal situation with my son, we had an autism diagnosis, but unfortunately at the time we were applying for an EHC plan. So because he had an autism diagnosis, the strategies they were wanting to put into his EHC plan were all those that work brilliantly for more classic presentations of autism. So the structure, the routine, the timetable, the predictable stuff, which just would not have worked for him and would have actually made his distress even worse. So it was important to me, for my son's specific scenario, in order to get the right support, we actually needed that signpost to a PDA profile rather than just you know, a more classic generalized autism diagnosis. So Karen, what's your thoughts on that particular question?
I think like Tom said, it depends on the situation. And I know for you it was really important. I think when my son was at primary school, he was assessed for autism and he didn't come out with a diagnosis because he made really good eye contact and he was articulate, so he's not autistic. Then when we transitioned to secondary school and his world fell apart, literally, I was really fortunate in the school where we were that the SENCO listened. The referral pathways were another 2 years and he'd already done a 2-year, you know, we'd been through everything. And so we really focused on it. I'd found out about PDA and I was fortunate because of my background in education. I went into the school and they did PDA training. So we managed to get the EHCP with no diagnosis of anything, but very much because of his age. I mean, and this is where it's so, I think, you know, if you're young and you can definitely get that diagnosis, but for us, we'd kind of gone through so much anyway, that it was so evident that his need was clear. And so we just described his need and we wrote all of the things that describe PDA into his ultimately the plan that he had. But we got that without a diagnosis. It was another 1.5 years before he got his diagnosis of autism. But again, we've not, because of all of that, we didn't have to. But the result of that was a child who'd been traumatized, been flighting from school, gone through all of those things to prove, which is, so it's a debate, isn't it, as to whether or not
it is, and I guess, you know, the important thing is that any diagnosis accurately describes what the strengths, difficulties, challenges are for that child so that appropriate support can be put in place. And I guess, you know, it can be helpful in certain scenarios for sure. Okay, lovely.
And certainly in terms of needs assessment, assessments we've had from people like occupational therapists and educational psychologists without a diagnosis have actually been more helpful when it comes to things like obtaining benefits and those areas. The diagnosis was neither here nor there in that case.
Okay, great. So we frequently hear that PDA people can mask their difficulties. So the inability to sort of hold in their distress, if you like. Can you give some examples of this?
Certainly when Ciara was at school, there was a lot of problems with, when we picked her up at the school gate, she would collapse. And it was touch and go whether we got her home before there was a meltdown. And yet the school was saying, oh, she's perfectly sociable. She's really good in the playground. She's got loads of friends. And we just weren't seeing that. We were seeing something quite different because she was just about able to mask through the school day, but her energy had disappeared by the time we picked her up. And so she had nothing left to carry on masking even for that trip home. The problems we've had in later life have been more around sort of medical appointments and those sort of areas. At the dentist, she's particularly anxious. She's very mouth sensitive. And on more than one occasion, we've had to step in and stop things because she's just completely shut down and she's masking her way through it and saying it's all okay. But her face is telling us something completely different.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess, you mentioned about school. We quite often hear from parents where the school, as you've said, they seem perfectly fine. They're just flying under the radar, getting through the day with no issues. But then the minute the young person gets home to their safe place where mum and dad or the carers will love them unconditionally, that's where they feel that they can just have some safe release of that energy that's been, building up throughout the day. So Karen, have you got any other examples that would illustrate masking?
I think that observing my son as he transitioned into secondary school, particularly, he became a different person. He developed an accent, he developed a character that he became in order to cope with being in school. And then again, exactly that same thing. As soon as he'd get home, just needed total quiet for a very long time to be able to unmask and just be himself again. And that was exhausting to the point of then not being able to go to school anymore because it was just too much to do.
And we do also hear from families who are perhaps separated, so where parents perhaps live apart, and perhaps parents or carers have different ways in which to parent, or a lesser understanding perhaps, or tolerance of PDA approaches. And I've certainly heard examples of families where the child is beautifully well behaved at one parent. The minute they come home to their regular place of residence, that's when they break down because they've been masking the whole time and they've been with the other parent, and sometimes that can cause discrepancies or questioning about one parent's ability, because why is it that they only the challenging behaviours as they appear are only happening at one home and not the other one. So the issue must be with that parent, and that can cause quite a few issues for sure. Okay, so what would you say have been some of your breakthrough moments as parents, or some of your light bulb moments, or top things that have really, really helped you and your children?
Well, my light bulb moment was reading the Understanding PDA book, and especially the first few chapters, which give a few sort of vignettes of typical PDA behaviour, things like the hands don't work kind of response to things. And I actually read some of them out to Kira, who turned around and said, "Why are they writing about me?" And it was that clear cut, really, that this was what was behind it, and that really helped us to start to understand that what we were seeing in terms of behaviour actually had a cause, and we could start to understand what that cause is and start to work on the causes of her behaviour rather than trying to tackle the behaviour head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can certainly think about the time that I actually found out or got sent some information about PDA from a friend, and as I was reading it, light bulbs were going off, and I remember just crying, because with almost relief that there was an explanation for this. My gut was telling me that this is not a naughty child who's just defiant. I knew, but just I've got a nursing background, and there was nothing that I could pinpoint or put it down to, and it was just so frustrating knowing that this was a distressed child, but nobody else saw that. So it was quite an emotional response for me, definitely. Karen, anything for you?
I think, well, I was in a Facebook group and somebody had mentioned PDA. I'd never heard of it, and then I went and did one of Laura Kirby's workshops, and I cried all the way home because I just felt distraught that I'd not realised what was really going on, and then really understanding interoception for and the struggles with that, not knowing whether you're anxious, whether you need to go to the room, and just all of those light bulb moments of what I was putting my child through in order to get him just to school in the morning, and then suddenly realising what was going on. Understanding PDA and then the PDA Society website I got pointed to, and Phil Christie's book, and there's still so much to learn, but I think every time I do training I get a light bulb moment. I'm like, oh yeah.
So yeah, there is some great reading material out there. Karen, which was the book that you're specifically referencing by Phil Christie?
The Understanding PDA.
Okay, yeah. Brilliant. Cool. So we often hear parents and carers and those involved in supporting PDA people that, you know, there are some mindset shifts that you have to adapt or adopt, I should say, look at things through different lenses. You know, certainly for me, one of them, or the biggest light bulb for me, was seeing distressed behaviours as a panic attack. That just helped me have a lot more empathy and understanding. And as Tom said, it really helped me stop trying to tackle the behaviour, but look for the root cause of the distress, which was really, really helpful. Have there been any other helpful mindset shifts that you've adopted that have been useful that you'd recommend?
There's a brilliant book by Barry Prisant, Uniquely Human, which talks about, among other things, a disability of trust, in that one of the things that autistic people often struggle with is trust, and not just trusting other people around them, but also trusting their own body. Mm-hmm. Kira still struggles massively to understand her own emotional reactions to things, to know whether her body's going to let her do something, even if she wants to do it. And so all the time she's struggling with, can I trust myself, never mind anyone else around me, mm-hmm. to get this done, and helping her with those aspects. And of course, you know, if you can't trust yourself, then there's a whole issue around self-esteem as well. Mm-hmm. You know, that has been more than half of the battle for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know he's got a lovely theory, actually, that the opposite of anxiety isn't actually calm, it is trust. And building that trusting relationship is absolutely vital. You know, and often masking can be reduced when the PDA individual trusts somebody. So sometimes it's a bit like a backhanded compliment that if you are the person who's seeing some of those distress behaviours or behaviour that's you know, can be quite challenging, it might be because they trust you and they feel that they can be their authentic self around you. So that was one of my mindset shifts, that actually it is a bit of a compliment that my child feels able to be, you know, demonstrate those distress behaviours around me. Lovely. Okay, we hear about picking your battles as well. That was another key moment for me. Has anybody got an illustrative example of perhaps how you've picked your battles?
I mean, I think I've got several in my head now, but we had a lot of experiences with flighting from school. When things escalated to fight or flight, the default would always be flight. And so I think letting go, I suppose it goes back to the last question as well, letting go of some expectations and fully understanding what's happening in that situation. And then, because we automatically, I think I definitely automatically wanted to reprimand, so you can't do this, you can't do that. When you really flip the way you think about everything, mm-hmm. and you start to say, okay, well, there was a reason for this, and what was that? And then understand, is it, but with this safety and trust, that's what it all does. It does all come back to, are they mm-hmm. safe? Who's the person they trust? How can you get them to that place where they feel that trust so that these things don't happen? But yeah, flipping my entire perception of parenting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was the only way.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And we do hear the expression, don't sweat the small stuff. And again, that was really, it was key to me, actually, you know, keeping my sanity at some points as well. And knowing that it was okay, you know, some things do happen and you just have to let them go. I can remember we'd bought my son a bike for Christmas, and he'd gone off with his mates on his bike, and I get a phone call to say that, you know, he's had a row with one of his friends and he's on his way home. And I could see him careering down the road, up the path, dumps the bike on the grass and goes up to his bedroom. And my traditional parenting response would have been, you know, come back downstairs, pick that bike up. We've spent a lot of money on that. Don't put it away in the shed. You need to look after your stuff. But actually being able to take that step back and really seek to understand what was going on for him, and recognising that actually he'd done the right thing. Instead of having a fight with his friend, he'd come home, you know, he'd taken himself off to his bedroom with no confrontation. And yeah, okay, he had dumped his bike on the grass, but, you know, it was more important that he'd taken himself up to his room to self-regulate. So on that occasion, you know, I chose to let that go. And I think, you know, certainly as parents and carers or those supporting PDA individuals, it is thinking about, you know, is this really important right now?
Absolutely. Often it's about a coping budget, and especially if we know there are big things still to get through in the day. You know, a busy shopping mall or something like that, if things are starting to go wrong, then it very much will be a case of, okay, we'll do the things we have to do, and you know, we'll use our coping budget on those, and the other things can wait till another day.
Yeah, I love that expression. I've not heard that before. That's great. Karen, have you anything to add on that?
Listening to coping budgets make me think that we do really, you know, we missed 7 dentist appointments one year just because it was just too much going on, and those build-ups. But that's okay. Yeah. We didn't make those, but then eventually we did when it was his choice because something was going on and he needed to. And I think, as we're talking about trust as well, it's us letting go and being able to trust our kids. They really do want to do well. And they will do the things when they're able to. I think it's like a daily letting go of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Okay. So we've mentioned briefly interoception and the part that sensory overload play in rising anxiety levels. So yeah, anybody want to just explain how that can be and what that might, or how that might manifest itself?
Well, it's often said that autistic people have no filter, so any input they're getting, they have to process. So if there's a lot of things going on a sensory level, then that means all their processing ability and all that coping budget is going on processing that, even if it's useless information that they process and discard, it's still used up their energy in doing it. And so yeah, it often builds up to something quite big because it's just using that budget up.
And the sound of a pencil, it took us about, my son was writing, drawing, doing things at home, but couldn't do that in the mainstream environment. He couldn't do it at school at all. But it took such a long time for us to realise that it was his auditory processing, and the sound of pencil on a piece of paper made him physically feel sick. So, you know, it's unpicking. So for me, fundamentally, I think if we could all understand sensory profiles right when our kids start nursery, then that should be the first parenting course everybody does. Understand your child's sensory profile.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. And we often hear parents and carers describing their PDA person as having Jekyll and Hyde characteristics, but what does that actually mean in reality?
It's very much about the speed with which things can change. It's that not just a really fast escalation to the point where they've lost control of things, but occasionally, not always, a really fast comeback as well, where they've been distracted by something else, their attention has been grabbed, and suddenly they're back on an even keel again, or at least appear to be. The actual underlying anxiety may still be right on the hair trigger edge of things, but yeah, you can often end up, certainly as a parent, trying to keep abreast of what's going on, feeling quite on eggshells, wondering what on earth happened and what's going to happen next, because things change so quickly.
Yeah, and that expression, walking on eggshells, I can certainly relate to that. You know, the anticipation of, am I going to trigger something? Am I going to cause some more distress, and just waiting for the response? And sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't, just depending on anxiety levels and you know, the different aspects on different days. So yeah, it can be quite confusing and difficult to understand, but yeah, it's just understanding it is about that anxiety.
Yeah, my daughter sometimes talks about good brain and bad brain, and when bad brain is in control, good brain is a passenger, an observer. So it can be a really quite completely different character
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So Karen, anything to add on that?
No, I was just thinking about how sometimes in training we talk about how my voice, because historically my voice was the demand machine, sometimes just me saying something, not when I didn't know. And this is the thing, if you don't know what's going on in your child at that particular moment in time, and then you say something, that would trigger an immediate escalation to, you know, to complete distress behavior immediately. So now it's very much, I've learned we communicate via text, and I've removed my voice from the scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, we often do things by non-verbal means, or even chat in the car where there's no need for eye contact.
Yeah. Okay. So as we know, autism is a spectrum, and actually, you know, PDA is a spectrum as well, and it can manifest itself very differently from different individuals, different times. What are some of the ways in which PDA can manifest itself, some of the more common ways?
So in terms of, I think, school, well, being out of school is hugely common, and being a sort of the whole build-up of this anxiety if needs aren't being understood or met. And this behavior is, well, not behavior, but there is being in an environment that's really challenging, then creates this distress, this huge anxiety around school. I think is one of the most common things. So yeah, 70% of children struggle to attend, or regularly struggle to attend school. And I think that's one of the key impacts that we have at the moment around PDA.
Yeah, that's school avoidance. And I don't suppose it's been helped really by lockdown, you know, with going on online and then back in the classroom and then back online. So, you know, a very, very distressing time, really. So, Tom, what else do we see on a sort of a day-to-day basis in terms of presentation?
Well, it's these various coping and avoiding strategies. I mean, kids will cope very well until they can't, and then it all falls apart. But the strategies they might use to cope, you know, as we discussed in one of the earlier slides, around procrastination, around strange ways that they say they're physically incapable of doing something, or even reverting into role play and fantasy as a way of avoiding doing these things that are causing them anxiety. And you know, these can sometimes we see very similar behaviours across a number of PDA people with those strategies as well. So it can be quite clear.
And we mentioned before, you know, it does relate to the ordinary things of daily life that we would perhaps take for granted. So some of the things that can be perceived as a demand, you know, we might think, why on earth is that? So, you know, teeth cleaning, personal hygiene. It can be avoided because it is a demand every time we ask them to do it. But equally, it could be a sensory issue. So if you think, you know, about a shower, for example, the PDA individual might not like the sensation of the water falling on them. So they avoid it because of that. But actually a bath's okay because that's a different sensation. Or with teeth cleaning because of the taste of the toothpaste or just the feel of the toothbrush in the mouth. So yeah, those seemingly mundane, everyday tasks that we take for granted can be really, really challenging. And until we understand about PDA, it can be really, really perplexing for us to actually understand it. So I guess as well, you know, another fundamental mindset shift that was really helpful for me was thinking about an iceberg. So when it comes to behaviours, so again, you know, I really had to learn to take a step back. If I was seeing a certain behaviour, you know, rather than trying to go in and tackle the behaviour, it was taking that step back and actually think, what is actually driving that? So, you know, with an iceberg, only 10% of what you see is above the waterline, and that is the behaviour. Actually, 90%, or the reason why that behaviour is happening, lies under the waterline. So we actually do have to take that step back, look for the root cause. What is it that's driving that behaviour? And ultimately, you know, I still even now have to ask myself the question, what is it that he's trying to tell me? Because, you know, when you are seeing that behaviour, all behaviour is a form of communication. So again, rather than jumping into it, it's taking that step back and really seeking to understand.
Yeah, some of the things we had that really confused me were around difficulties putting shoes on or putting the coat on, or when we got to the car, really elaborate routine around getting into the car and getting the seatbelt put on. And we eventually realized it was actually all about leaving the house and the anxiety of going out of a safe environment. But it wasn't the act of leaving the house that was the trigger point that we were seeing. We were seeing it on the actions around that. It took a while to get to look at that iceberg and work out what was happening underneath.
Yeah, I can remember when my son was much younger, and he hated bedtime, absolutely hated it. Sleep was something that had to be avoided. But you know, we tried, and we started with the stories, and I'd lie on his bed next to him and read his story, and like I'd be falling asleep myself, and he'd say, "You can't finish yet. You have to finish only when the chapter finishes on a page on the right hand side of the book." You know, and you can guarantee it'd be at least 4 chapters time. Or if I said one word that was perhaps I've missed a word out or mispronounced one, I had to start the whole chapter again. And it was really, I just couldn't get my head around it. But now I understand it was that procrastination, it was the delaying tactics, trying to take control in order to avoid the demand of actually going to sleep. So yeah, they can be very creative in the way that demands are avoided. Definitely.
It took us a long time to get our head around the idea that sleep is something that is actually a demand to be avoided as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, my son's 17 now, and when I see some more perhaps intriguing behaviour or unusual behaviour that I don't understand, again, I really have to stop and think, what is it that's driving that? So, you know, on you know, a work day, for example, particularly on a Monday, he's always really hungry on a Monday morning before work and can't possibly leave until his tummy feels full. And no matter what I offer him as a choice for breakfast, that won't fill me up, that won't fill me up. And again, it's like, you know, you could argue that, well, this will, if you have that, and that, you will feel full. But there's no point, because this is just his way, you know, or it's just a way his anxiety manifests itself. He's anxious on a Monday going to work. And perhaps also he's confusing that sensation of anxiety with the feeling of hunger because, you know, of his interoception issues. So yeah, it's really fascinating. So seeking to understand is absolutely something key. So do either of you have any examples of what can happen when the right support is put in place, and what a positive impact that's been for your child?
I think, yeah, I can talk about, so my son was out of school having alternative provision. So his school funded alternative provision for about 2.5 years. My local authority then agreed an EOTAS package, and that was all ready to go from this coming September. But as true PDA style, my son about 2 months ago, suddenly having had 2.5 years out, being supported, learning more about himself and having the recovery time he needed, of his own fruition, is just like, I want to go back to school. And it's taken a lot of time, a lot of working with school, timetabling things in, because what he wants is his social interaction. He doesn't want to go to school to learn. It's not about that. Fortunately, his school's on board with that. They understand that. So they've been incredible at creating a bespoke timetable where he can just come in order for him to see his friends. And it's GCSEs at the moment. He should be doing his GCSEs. Would he be in school? And we've now got to the point where he wasn't going to be allowed in because it's GCSEs, but they've created now, right, we've identified what does he really want. He wants to go in to meet a friend, to then be able to go into the local town to do things, which is something he's not been able to do, but because he wants to, he is so well activated to do it all, and it's amazing. So yeah.
So that's a really great example of some of the positive things that can come about when there is understanding and the appropriate support is put in place. That's brilliant. So we do know, I mean, we mentioned before the fact that many PDA children, up to 70% of them, are either not in school or regularly struggle to attend. So for anybody listening in today, where can they find more information about school difficulties?
So there's the EHCP guide online. There's the hub, and then there's also there's the education hub, but as well there's the homeschool hub, isn't there, Tom?
There is Home Education Hub, yeah, and we home educated for well, 9 years plus now, and absolutely, it's certainly a way to go. It is a lifestyle change for the whole family, which not everyone's in a position to do, but it does give you that, as you were just saying. Sometimes what you find is when they're ready and they want to do something, they'll move forward with it pretty much under their own steam, just with a bit of help and support. And in home education, we can roll with the punches. We can do that. As soon as she's ready to go to do something, we'll support her and we'll move forward with it, even if it's not, a school would see it age appropriate, or on the curriculum. If she's ready for it, we'll do it and we'll move forward.
Great. So it sounds from what we've been discussing that flexibility, adaptability in everything that we do is absolutely crucial, and really building that trust can go a long way in making sure that PDA people do have the best experience that they possibly can. So it's been brilliant speaking to both of you this evening, and hopefully everybody's really got a lot of new information, and if you do need further information, please feel free to contact the inquiry line, which is info@pdasociety.org.uk, and then our website as well, www.pdasociety.org.uk. As we mentioned earlier, there are lots of resources available to support you, and if you want to find out more. We also have the PDA Society shop, where you can get lots of lovely panda merchandise, but also some awareness cards or alert cards for individuals to carry around with them should they need to. We do have a regular giving campaign, so if you would like to and are able to contribute a small regular amount every month to the charity, that would be very, very welcome and make a great difference to the work that we do. And we also have a newsletter as well, which you can sign up for. It's delivered electronically into your inbox on a monthly basis. So thank you both, Karen and Tom, for your time this evening. It's been fascinating to hear your different perspectives and experiences. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So thank you for listening. We're highly active on most social media platforms, so feel free to give us a tweet or follow us. Thank you.